Thank you very much. Today I will talk about cities of tomorrow. So, in general, the project is about creating interactive visual, so computer graphics tools to help for designing and improving existing and future cities. So it spans a wide variety of disciplines, including GIS, computer science, earth atmospheric sciences, urban planning, architecture, civil and traffic engineering, and so forth. And we have collaborators in all of these areas. So this work is not just me, of course, there's a bunch of collaborators, and as far as other professors, professionals, and students who've been doing this work roughly over the last 5+ years, 5 or 8 years, we've been working on this. So I'm going to kind of present it all as kind of a coherent story, but in reality it's been over time in multiple fragments. So first, let's talk about urban growth. So we all know that cities are growing, but let's give it some numbers. So here is some report about the growth of cities in the world. So you can see here for different continents, the growth. And maybe you can just pull out from here that Asia has a lot of the growth from the last few decades, and also South America, which is number 3, has a lot of growth. But you can see in general, the increase of population has really skyrocketed since the 1900s. The last 100 years or so, the amount of people have greatly increased in the world. The next question is, where is this growth happening? So the interesting lines here is this third line down is the current developed cities, which means cities like New York, San Francisco, Lima, Beijing. Those are developed areas. Yes, they are growing, and at some constant rate. But what's interesting is that most of the growth of the world is not in those mega cities, but in these here, which are cities like Arequipa, which are growing from maybe 10,000 people to 1 million people. That's where most of the urbanization and growth is occurring, this line here. So why do we care about urban and city planning? Well, there's, of course, the population growth itself, right? There is more than 50% of the world population lives in these cities. The cities occupy only about 2% of the Earth's surface. So even though the Earth is some size, most people live in 2% of the Earth. And it's already at 50%, and it's going to be at 60% in the next decade or two. Cities produce use two-thirds of all the energy, 60% of the water, and produce 70% of the greenhouse gases. So cities are pretty important. They use energy and produce lots of waste. So we, of course, want to see sustainable, smart, green cities so that we get better transportation, more efficient buildings, less use of energy, conservation of water, and reuse and smart grid infrastructure and so forth. All these are things that we want because of all this crazy urbanization going on in the world. So, we've been talking about a city. So what exactly is a city? That's maybe a question that's, is Arequipa a city? Is a small town outside of here a city? What is a city? Well, there is no single answer to that question. People might use other words, city, town, metropolis. But pretty much a city just means it's a complicated thing. There's a bunch of processes. Things don't actually happen at random. There's a reason why cities act the way they do. But it's not simple. It just is complicated. There is these chaotic dynamics and there is bottom-up processes. But in general, it is a system. A city is a system. It's a live system and it works in some way. And this is fortunate because it means that we can control the way in which the city develops and grows. We want to learn how to do that. some of the previous talks here at the conference have been looking into ways of analyzing and visualizing what's happening in a city and things like that. Here we're going to look a little bit at that, but also kind of in the planning thing. So planning to the future, what do we want to do to the city in the future? So this concept of urban planning is not new. We can look back, of course, to the Spaniards, right, who came around here in the 1500s, and they founded several cities, and they had a magic formula. They said, let's make a plaza. Around the plaza, we'll make a palace, church, courthouse, and a prison, and the rest of the rectangles we'll give out to the rich people. And that was the plan for urban planning here in South America in the 15 and 1600s. And if you actually look at historical records, this is exactly what you see. That doesn't work today. We can't do something as simple as that. It's a much more complicated process. Now, I could talk a whole bunch about urban planning because I've been collaborating with those people, but I'll summarize it down to this computational urban design pipeline. So the first part is we have an input where we design or we model a future city or a current city. Then we simulate some kind of behavior. Maybe the behavior is evolution of land price, real estate, house price. Maybe it's population, maybe it's traffic, maybe it's weather. And then we visualize the result. We see what happens. We measure what happens. We have indicators. This is, in a general sense, the computational urban design pipeline. So the input could be modeled by hand using city engine. Maybe we take laser scans or LiDAR scans of cities. That's the input. And then we simulate something. Here is a weather simulation. And then we get an output. Maybe it's flooding, maybe it's rain, maybe it's population growth. So the ideal for urban planning is how can we least change the input, maybe the city, to obtain the output that we want. Maybe it's weather, whatever our concern is. That's the ideal question, the ideal thing we want to answer. So our inspiration, so this is what people urban planning do, is, I think I'm a backwards guy. I'll think the opposite way. We'll think in terms of results because that's more intuitive, right? We want to design by result. We call this inverse modeling. So we've taken this pipeline here, rather than going from we design something, we simulate it, and then we see what happens. We want to go the opposite direction. We know what we want to happen, but we don't know what is the city that produces that output. That's the type of questions we like to answer. And maybe it's design a new city, or maybe it's changes to a city. So, we want some output. How do we change the city to accomplish that output? So that's our mentality in the work that we do. It's a little kind of directly backwards of a standard thinking. Now, this concept of inverse modeling actually has a growing popularity in mathematics. There's, as a few years ago, even in mathematics, conferences called, inverse modeling. And there is a notion of reverse engineering, which has been around in the engineering field. So this is a formalization of that idea of thinking backwards. Let's not design, simulate, and visualize. Rather, let's say what we want, and then we compute what's the input that produces that output. Or what is the change to the city that produces some output that we want. So we know what we want, but not how to obtain it. So we define the output and find the input. So we do this with all the work that we've done through a combination of simulations and machine learning and mathematics and agent-based systems and so forth. So we use a bunch of machinery to accomplish things in different solutions I'm going to show you today. And as I said, inverse modeling has a presence in mathematics, engineering, and so forth. So let me zoom in to a mini computer graphics lecture about procedural modeling. So we like procedural modeling. Procedural modeling is this concept, so in computer science, this idea of grammars and procedures. And in computer graphics, the term procedural modeling means we want to generate a written set of rules and parameters that generate some output. That's a procedural model. And usually you mean a forward procedural model. An inverse procedural model means the opposite. We want to discover what rules and parameter values produce a given model. So we're going backwards. This is where we are going to fit in, this inverse procedural modeling. So I'll give you an example very quickly of a forward procedural modeling. This is a Lindemeyer system or an Eller system. This was created in the 1960s and 70s. It was first used for modeling of plants and trees. So very quickly, there's rules that apply in every iteration, and there's parameters which you define. So maybe you have some variable called an A, you have some constants plus, minus, which means rotation, and you have an initial string, maybe it's just the letter A, and then you have a rule. And whenever you see an A, you replace it with A, rotate left, A, rotate right, A, and so forth. That's a rule. And maybe you associate with the letter A dashed line, this one. So that's an A. That's exactly A. And now I apply the rule once, and I get this. I apply the rule 2 times, and I get that. So this is an application of an Eller system. So I can jump forward and say people have modeled plants, like I said. So here is the actual rule, the parameters, the axiom, and how many iterations are applied. And you can model plants. These are different plants modeled with 1 or 2 of these Eller system rules. So this is a procedural generation system for generating plants. It's very compact. And it can be stochastic, doesn't have to be deterministic. It can be in 3D, you can generate 3-dimensional plants. And you just have to have more symbols and 3D rotations, and there's much more elaborate pictures than this, but this is the basics. So now that was forward procedural modeling, in this case for plants. Now let me jump to an example of an inverse procedural modeling. What do I mean by inverse? Well, we start with some vectors defining this thing which looks like a tree. That's what we're given. We want to discover what are the rules that create this tree. So therefore we analyze and we obtain an Eller system that produces exactly that input. The rules look like something. So some kind of an Eller system with some rules and some parameters that exactly produces that input. So from this input, we actually figured out the rules that produced that. Once we know those rules, now we can change things. We can say, oh, let's change the parameters a little bit and produce other types of trees. That's the reason for learning these rules. So we figured out from the input data what are the rules which make it work, and then we can change it and experiment and do what if analysis and so forth. We can jump to 3D buildings. Let's say that our input is this triangle soup, some very simple building model. This looks like an extremely simple house. All we're given is a polygon description. We just have this. We have no other information. So we can figure out the set of procedural rules that generate this very particular output. And here it is. This was generated automatically. Then we can modify some of these rules, and then we can generate different output. Same thing applied to buildings. And then here's a more complex example of another building that we got from the internet. We downloaded a random polygonal model, and then we learned the rules that generate this. We figured out on the fly, and then we can generate other variations very simply just by slightly changing these rules. This is the idea again of inverse procedural modeling. We can take a Manhattan world, so like New York City, which was popular in a previous talk. So this is a picture of Manhattan, and a student of mine observed, you know what? These are the 3 rules that produce any building of Manhattan style. So Manhattan style means that the faces of the building are planar, and then all the edges are 90 degrees. So it turns out that with these three rules, which are written in an L system-like notation here on purpose, you can actually create any of these buildings. And then we further realized that in fact you can condense these three rules into one super rule, which we call the generalized rewriting rule for Manhattan buildings. And then we can take a picture of any Manhattan building and we can figure out the set of rules that generated that picture, that building in that picture. And then we can, then we have a model of that 3D building obtained from the picture. And then we can do many things with such 3D models. We can change them, get more of them, texture map them, render them, and so forth. Yes? No. So in this Manhattan case, they are predefined. In the previous ones, they were not. So I was going to get to the fact that in this inverse procedural modeling, right, you might know the rules or you might not. Both are valid cases, both are things we've explored. The more difficult case is, of course, if you do not know the rules or the parameters. You don't know any rules of why or whatever it is that you have is produced. Here's another one. So I'm giving you a few examples and then I'm going to kind of come to the next part of the talk, organization, which will make more sense. Here, so I just did the Manhattan worlds. We can also apply these to sketching, which we did. So here, we let the human make a digital sketch with a pen, digital pen or a mouse, and as they're sketching, we kind of intuit, we figure out what is it that they're sketching, and we kind of complete the rest of it automatically because we learn, we figure out what they're doing on the fly. So this uses, of course, a lot of machine learning, deep learning, all those things which are in style. So here, from this sketching input, we can generate this very quickly, almost automatically from your sketch. And then we can re-render it in any computer graphics way that we want. I have a short video I want to show you here just to drive this home. So this is an example sketching session. So as you're sketching, it kind of figures out, oh, you're doing this, you're doing that, from a database of kind of all possible building options that it was trained with. So you sketch a few lines and it figures out the rest. And if you don't like it, you can just keep on sketching and change it to be whatever you actually want it to be. But it greatly reduces the amount of time it takes you to make something. So again, here we're doing inverse procedural modeling, right? We don't know the output, we're learning it on the fly as you're going, generating the parameters and rules. So in general, I've been I motivated and gave some examples of this inverse kind of urban modeling, urban research. And I've talked about some things at the building scale. We've also done things at the scale of parcels. That means the land around a building. We've also done work for road networks, for vegetation in the city, and at the city scale. So I've only talked about things at the building scale and a little bit of motivation before that. And we've done the research at different levels. I'm going to jump now to talk about kind of the, I think, of the more exciting, very end case applications at the city scale. So in particular, we've done work where we've done this inverse design logic to try and figure out applications for smart cities, for designing cities of the future, where we consider socioeconomical aspects, consider geometry, traffic, and weather. In all these, we use a very similar inverse modeling logic, but I won't be able to go in as much detail as I did with the building one, even though there I was pretty coarse in detail, but I'm going to go more at the kind of the results level for these applications. Sometimes I will give some details. So let me start with the first one, socioeconomic. So here, our idea was to tightly integrate a socioeconomical simulation with a procedural modeling engine to generate cities. So what does it mean here? It means if we're given the terrain of some place in the world, we're given the total population, the population distribution, a 2D map of where people live very coarsely. We're given the highways because highways are created by political decisions, not necessarily by demand. A single click of where downtown is and any major parks. Combine this with our inverse modeling system, we'll produce something like this. And here we were given the data of this physical location. This is actually a city in California. It's called Pacific Grove. It's a little bit isolated. So it's a peninsula. So we are given here the yellow highway, number of people, the major parks, which are mostly these things here. And we synthetically generated the entire model of the city. So this is a picture from Google Earth. This is actually a top-down view of a full 3D model of that city, which we generated in a few minutes. And if we look at comparative areas, so we see, oh look, this is, there are some boxes here. There's an orange box here and an orange box there. These are the pictures for the corresponding areas. And this is a picture for another corresponding area. You see the different areas are qualitatively similar. So if this here is your house, your exact house is not going to be there. But a house of the same size as yours, people with the same income as you, and house prices about the same as your house will be here. So while this is not useful for GPS navigation, it is useful for other things of urban planning, where you want to think at the scale of, gee, how are the housing prices here? How do I change things? Later things I'll talk about, like weather and traffic and so forth. But this inverse modeling gave us a full 3D model of a city in a few minutes from very coarse information. And the way we did that is we integrated a behavioral and a geometrical simulation. A city has a logic. So there's actually an agent-based simulation here. This is in collaboration with people who create what is called urban simulators that have been deployed in cities throughout the world. Like 100 cities last time I looked have this urban simulation platform in use. It just proves that their urban simulation platform is actually can be adapted to some particular city. So we don't actually use that. We made our own version. First we used theirs, then we made our own version, which we modified so that now we can kind of simulate the way a city behaves. And since we can do that, we can now infer what must a city be that behaves like this input information we gave. And from that, we can automatically create a plausible entire 3D model of a city. And this is useful for some applications. For instance, so we have a socioeconomical simulation, geometry, a procedural modeling engine, and there's all these components, and there's all these, the system contains a bunch of equations and algorithms that implement different parts of this simulation system. It's all tightly integrated and so forth. And there's urban variables defined over the 2D spatial domain, and we seek what's called an equilibrium. So all these variables, we compute the differential equations when possible. If not, we use approximations with finite differences. We get all these systems, and we run a dynamical system, and we end up with some kind of a way of mathematically modeling a city. The whole hard part is how do you write these equations or these algorithms, and that's where the work is. But that's what we figured out over these several years, several papers, how to do this for a variety of cities. So for instance, we have some city that has some population, and now we want to change the terrain, and then we want to say, how would this city be changed? So this here is another version of this same city with the same number of people, the same job distribution, the same population distribution, the same job distribution, but they're relocated to other areas based on the most sensible and plausible change. We can make some other change, we can add mountains and so forth. So this is, of course, a rather drastic change. We play God here and we suddenly carve away land and make mountains, right? But you can also do more subtle changes. This is, for instance, we deployed this to the San Francisco area. This was a huge project with about a dozen PhD students. We deployed a software system to be used by about an area of the San Francisco Bay Area. There's 9 counties, I think, about 7 million people and 1.5 million houses and buildings. So we created a system all based on this and we gave it to them, and here are some example of view of the output for urban planning, so that that particular urban planning agency could generate scenarios. Gee, what if we did this? What if we did that? How would it change the landscape of the San Francisco Bay Area? Okay, so that was the socio-economical exploration we did. The next one is a little more geometrical. So here we created this system which has multiple components. Basically, we have a kind of a procedural generation of a city, produces geometry, then we can measure some indicators, some properties of this city. I'll talk about those in a sec, these indicators. And then we can figure out how to change the city so that we obtain some output. So given a procedural city model, some existing city that we have synthetically created, maybe it's based on reality, maybe it's an imaginary city, and a set of desired indicators, desired output values, we discover how to change the city to obtain that output. And the main components is the procedural model. We have this inverse generation system which uses random sampling optimization as well as deep learning. I guess it was shallow learning at that point. And there is also some interactive and rendering system and so forth. To give you an idea of the building model parameters, so these are the things in a city that we say we can change. So we can change the mean height, the average height of buildings, the roughness of the building height, so standard deviation, how far back are the buildings from the roads, the space between buildings, and then the road curvature, irregularity, and parcel sizes, amount of parks. We say these are things that we can control. The things we want to measure at the output are things like how walkable is the city, the pollution, the sun exposure, visibility, accessibility, and so forth. So of these, let me just talk about sun exposure. So sun exposure, what do I mean by that? It means the sun goes over some path wherever your city is, and there's some number of hours of sun that each building receives. This number might be important for things like solar panels or to measure how much natural light your buildings get. So this is one indicator. There's multiple of these that we created. So here, for instance, are some city designs that have different sun exposure values. Sun exposure is coded into a color scheme here where red means lots of sun exposure. So this top solution here is very bluish, so there's not much sun exposure as you would expect. These buildings in here, there's more of the ones in the perimeter. And this bottom one, because there's space between the buildings, as you'd expect, actually more buildings get sun exposure. So this is one, and there is distance to park, there's floor to area ratio, there is accessibility, there's pollution, many other indicators. So here's one example result where we want to obtain some design that has high shadows versus low shadows. So if we as the urban office of a city can enforce different zoning rules for different parts of the city, we can get a preview of what happens if we enforce these particular urban policies, urban rules. Then we get stuff that looks like this. And if we enforce urban policies that have these values, we'll get things like that. So this is kind of the output. So we can know what type of urban policies we want to enforce so the city evolves in some way that we want it to. We did some other example here. This was actually, let me go to the end first, an area in India, Bangladesh. So an architectural firm was hired to help redesign the downtown. and then they subcontracted to our lab, one of my students, to help with our visualization tool to predict how they should redesign some down parts of Bangladesh so that it has some particular sun exposure, interior light, and distance to park for the new structures. So then this was an iterative design process where they would say, we want to increase distance to park on average by, or decrease distance to park by 50%. We want to increase sunlight by 30% and so forth. So then we came up kind of an automatic way with various proposals of how you could configure the downtown of the city to enable this. So this was actually empirical deployment. Well, it was given to this design company. I don't know if it was actually done in Bangladesh. Another example is in traffic. So I'm sure you've noticed that traffic is a continual issue in cities, and as there's more cars and people, traffic only seems to get worse. So with this tool, we wanted to ask the question, how would you design the traffic of a city? How would you change, you should alter your city to obtain the traffic that you want? Now you could of course propose things like, totally changing all roads and adding expensive highways, but that's expensive. Maybe the more interesting questions are, what small changes can I do such that I get the traffic pattern that I want? So that's exactly what we did here. So given some kind of current road network, maybe we get that from OSM, which is OpenStreetMap, which even has streets of Lima and Arequipa in it, or we somehow got it from a procedural model, and then the user can literally paint in our program where they want more traffic, where they want less traffic. Now, of course, you could say I want less traffic everywhere, but that's an impossible solution. The cars have to go somewhere. So we can control the solution it produces by indicating we want less traffic here and more traffic there. And that's a spatial decision. It could also be a temporal decision. Maybe in the morning, you want low traffic here and high traffic there. In the evening, we want some other pattern. And that's okay. So you specify this to our system, and it'll figure out how to alter the direction of the roads, maybe alter which roads you have, and maybe move where people live and where the jobs are. So this is an escalating cost. The lowest cost is just alternating the direction of the roads. Higher cost solution is adding, removing roads, and even higher cost solution is changing where people live and where they work, or at least where the company is located. But from our point of view, these are all these different costs, so you can just say, all I want to do is change lanes, and then that's fine. In all cases, you can find the lowest cost change that achieves the traffic change that you want. So implicitly here, we're doing traffic simulation, so micro traffic simulation. We're geared up with leaders in traffic engineering, state-of-the-art traffic simulation software and so forth, and we made this design tool. So one example result that we did of several is the following. So this is a lower part of Manhattan, so New York City, and for some estimated population and jobs data, we determined that the average travel time, vehicular travel time, so using cars, if people go from where they live to where they work, was 60 minutes, and it took them, and they used about 1,000 grams, they produced 1,000 grams of carbon monoxide, so pollution. So what we want to do is, how can we reduce the average travel time to 50 minutes, 40 minutes, 30 minutes? What would we need to do to the city to make this possible? So we came up with several solutions. Our system, again, is interactive. You use it as some painting, and we get an answer. So for instance, if we wanted to reduce the average time to 50 minutes, we would have to change the direction of 52 streets in Lower Manhattan. And if we alter it in the direction that we say, then according to our simulation, you would have faster travel time. If you wanted to reduce the travel time to 40 minutes, then you'd actually have to change only 34 lanes, but some people in jobs would have to be relocated. Otherwise, it wasn't possible by just changing lanes. And if you want to reduce travel time in half, then you have to do the following changes here. So this is the type of output that we can give you. And again, there are other solutions and other intermediate answers. I'm just giving you a quick summary. And these are pictures here. This is, I guess, jobs. That's where people live. And these are other versions of it. And finally, about weather. This is actually what we're mostly working on and we're really excited about. So some background. First of all, the shape and the materials of a city affect your local weather. This might be obvious, but quantizing this is actually pretty new science, maybe about 10 years old, maybe even less. So just by changing the shape of your buildings and the materials that you use, you can alter the local weather. Now, it's not like you can suddenly make it be summertime when it's wintertime, or you can make it snow, right? But you can modulate the local weather based on the shape of the city and the materials you use. There's some phenomena called the urban heat island that's pretty well known, which is the fact that the man-made materials in cities, concrete, cement, and so forth, absorbs heat. At nighttime, this heat is released. It's not really released, but rather the sunlight is gone, so therefore what's hot is the buildings, and that kind of becomes the local heat production. So it releases the heat at nighttime. But there's much more things happening. Humidity, wind patterns, and even there's been a few phenomena which is still at the research front, which occurs in cities as suddenly tornadoes are produced, or very drastic storms and rainfall inside cities. And you ask, gee, just bad luck? Do we get weather? Or is it actually the city and its shape and its materials which made some kind of atmospheric phenomena going over the city suddenly get worse? The latter is the belief that the city's shape and energy production and consumption actually might trigger some of these events to occur. So you might want to make cities that don't generate tornadoes, don't generate heavy thunderstorms. Exactly what that means varies completely from city to city, and this is all still new science. But definitely there is an influence of the city to the weather. And also the other way, the weather influences how the city grows. So here's a first work that we did, where we're given some terrain, population, and then some land use data from satellite imagery, and using the first socioeconomic system I mentioned to you, we generate a plausible model. This one here I think is, Indianapolis. So it's the big city near Purdue University. It's about a million person city. Fine, so we have the model of this city. We can now take some historical database, and we can take some day in the summer, some years in the past. We can simulate the weather over the city, and we can verify the weather actually that we simulate is similar to the weather that actually occurred. Fine, so we did this. So we have a good weather prediction system because it actually predicted what actually occurred. Now we can change the city in some way. Let's say that we put trees in this lower corner here, this southwest corner. We just play God and we put a bunch of trees. But then we ask the city to reorganize. We want the same number of people, same jobs, same industries. So using our urban simulation, everything gets relocated. So we're not saying, of course, have less people, and that would be obvious that you have less structures. Same people, same jobs, same economy gets relocated. Then we rerun the weather simulation, and we get different scenarios. So if we were to put trees in this northeast corner versus the southeast corner, we get a very different behavior. So this here is Indianapolis, which is this part here. This is the whole state, the whole region. And then you can see if we green the northeast corner, on average, the temperature increases by about 1 degree centigrade. And if we were to green the southeast corner, on average, the temperature reduces by 1 degree centigrade. So it means, depending where the trees are, we can alter the local weather by 2 degrees centigrade, the average weather, in this sunny day in some summer. Now, this is some very particular solution for some very particular cities. Other studies have shown that this variation can be as much as plus minus 8 degrees Celsius, or a 16-degree range. So it can be huge in some cases. It's not in this one. So maybe that's a hot city configuration, and this is a cool city configuration. And we can try other things. We can make a kind of a circle of parks. We can make distributed parks, which is much more practical, saying you have to have so many parks in a city every so often. And these give you other weather patterns. Now, depending on what your city is, you might want more temperature, less temperature, more humidity, less humidity, and that depends on what the city would like, right? We're not saying one is better than the other. In some more recent work, which took us a while to get to, we actually tightly integrated an urban weather simulation. This is a very large project together with many other people. And now we have a way of saying, well, let's say that you want in the morning you want, I can't read there. I used to be able to read there, but not anymore. You want maybe overcast, you want clouds in the morning, sun in the afternoon, and a little bit of clouds in the evening. Maybe that's what you want. So how do you make a city such that it yields that type of weather pattern? So then here is when we're showing you the cloud production, and there is some particular change of this city that yields this weather pattern. So that's a design tool here. So we alter the heights and the albedos and many different cases that we tried that we can suggest of how you get this particular weather pattern. Now, which one do you want? Oh, I don't know. You can choose. Maybe you want, sunny mornings and cloudy evenings, or maybe you want cloudy mornings and sunny evenings, the opposite. That's up to you. And of course, under different global, regional weather scenarios, things would be different. So then maybe you would see multiple scenarios and you come up with a single configuration that works the best for the multiple types of weather phenomena that occur in your city. So this is a really exciting tool, and we're going to try in the process of putting this online so that people can just choose their city and play with these tools. Here's another one. This is for temperature control. So one kind of semi-popular thing that's going around to try and alter the temperature of a city is changing the color of the roofs. So simplistically, your roofs can either be black or white. If they're black, they absorb. If they're white, they reflect the sunlight. So what should you do? Should you paint all roofs black or all roofs white, etc.? So here we have some tool that allows us to vary how many roofs and which roofs are white, which roofs are black, to get some desired weather change. I think this one here had 48% white, 17% parks, and it was able to reduce the temperature by about 1 to 2 degrees centigrade on average in the city by having white roofs and some parks. Now, it's not only us who are saying that these are possible changes, right? We, again, have collaborators in the Earth Atmospheric Sciences, and there's all these infrastructures trying to determine this. We are the ones that are putting it all together to yield this system which does this. And at the bottom, remember, I'll repeat, we're using this inverse modeling logic where we have an initial model, we figure out the geometry and the rules and the policies that yield that result. So that initial things I mentioned about buildings, all that stuff is being used, but it's deep hidden inside this type of system. So about usage, that brings me to this effort, which I'm really excited about. This is an effort called WUDOPT, which is World Urban Database and Application Portal Technologies. It's a pretty big title. And there's a website, it's called wudopt.org. And the leaders of this are two other gentlemen, but our lab is part of this effort, and we're hosting the portal here, so these computational tools. And this is a worldwide effort to try and collect information about urban areas so that you can do a bunch of what if urban planning scenarios related to climate, to pollution, to socioeconomic development, all the traffic, all these things we're talking about. So in its current stage, they're using crowdsourcing as well as some deep learning tools that are provided on the website to try and model the climate zones for cities around the world. I know there's a professor who's leading about 200 Peruvian cities he's trying to put in the WoodUp database. Right now there's like 100 plus big cities, and it's continually growing. If you go there, you can go to the portal and you can download all the information. It's all free. This is a grassroots effort. There's many people involved. If you want to get involved, let me know. And so this is the website. I just mentioned all of this. And in particular, our group is hosting the portal tools. So there's a portal there, and there's some very basic tools, and that will be continually growing of things you can do at this world scale. So if you're interested in doing some of this urban planning for Arequipa, then you should go there. You should see Arequipa's not there now, but maybe this professor I know, I don't know if he's doing Arequipa. He's from Lima, so I don't know whether so he's not from the country of Arequipa, right? And so you guys can put in the information for Arequipa, and then you'll have access to all these tools, and you can do weather simulations and plannings and all these things that are coming about on this effort. And if you have some tool you want to contribute, let me know. I manage all the tools, and maybe we'll put it on the website as well. And there's conferences that we host about once per year where the users and the WoodUp community gets together and we discuss what to do next and so forth and so forth. It's roughly a 4-year-old effort, so it's still pretty new. Okay, so to conclude, this inverse modeling logic, which I mentioned to you, I think is really exciting, and there's still much to do. And now we're working on crowd simulation and walkability, so we're trying to say, gee, if you want people to walk around the city in a particular way, how do we alter the sidewalks of the city to make the people walk and flow in the way that we want to? That's actively what we're doing now. We're doing more efforts of trying to model on the building scale from photographs, doing even better jobs of modeling city models. We're doing satellite imageries and trying to construct whole urban areas from satellite imageries. Again, create a procedural model from a satellite image. So all these things, I haven't even talked about this, and it's all what we're working on right now. In general, the need for urban design and modeling is only growing. As I mentioned, the world population is at 7,000 million, and it's going to be 10,000 million in not too long a future. And we got to do something with all these people. We got to organize where to put them, where they live, and so forth. And many cities worldwide are in fact using, and even more of them are using, such digital computational tools. Myself, I've at least visited and done work with the cities I see listed here, and I hope to be doing continually more. Some of my other collaborators have dealt with many other cities I haven't even listed there. And that's it. Thank you for all the people that gave money. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Hey, Daniel, great. Really interesting follow-up on the earlier presentation. I was curious, you rely on inverse modeling. How well-posed or ill-posed are these problems? I mean, is it typically, you gave us solutions, answers, in the variety of examples that you presented. How difficult was it actually to get those, and are there in fact, for any particular problem specification, you could have come up with 10 different answers that would have satisfied the constraints that the user had posed?
So fundamentally, most of inverse modeling is ill-posed, right? So, which means that you specify the answer, the question, and then there's very high sensitivity to yielding an answer. You can subtly change something here and your answers change drastically. That is an issue. So in my simplified presentation, right, I show you an answer, but usually we give a suite of answers, and we have some metric to try and gauge which one is closer to what you asked for. And usually we'll show you 3, 4, 5, and say, pick one. And then I picked one for the slides, right? So that's the empirical answer to there. And maybe other side of empirical, is it a limiting issue? No, I don't think it's a limiting issue. I think yielding a few answers and having the human choose is okay. If none of those answers would be good, that would be bad. But usually we end up with a pretty reasonable answer. I have some slides I didn't show, which went into stability analysis and sensitivity analysis. So, you know, how when I change input, how much I should change the output, and is it too crazy? So in some cases we've done these tests and it wasn't that crazy, in which case it's useful. Anyone else?
First, I have to thank you because for the interesting presentation. My question is about the accuracy of the inverse modeling. How accurate is it, and how we can get more accurate results?
So that's not easy. The question of accuracy is not easy to answer because it means something very different in different scenarios. So in the initial examples where we were constructing buildings, then the rules we produce yield exactly the input. So therefore the accuracy is 100%, but are the rules actually what was used to create that building? I don't know, probably not. It was made by an architect and a bunch of people with cement. So many other rules, right? When we talk about trees, so I don't exactly show, but with a colleague, they looked into inverse modeling of trees. So the output is exactly the input, but they get back a set of rules. Is that what Mother Nature uses to create trees? Not exactly, right? That's a other process there. When we talk about urban, now we jump to city scale. So we might come up with I didn't show you, there was some paper we did where given a scanned model of a large area of a city, buildings, multiple buildings, we come up with rules as to the shape and configuration of that part of the city. Those rules exactly produce the input, but not necessarily were they used when they designed that part of the city. So that's hard to answer. But a relevant thing I can maybe say is expressivity, which means do you end up computing something which can yield stuff that's similar to your input, that you can control, you can do useful things with? That's a more difficult question, and that is challenging. So we can come up with some kind of, and maybe at the previous question, we can come up with some kind of an answer that we can change to produce alternate configurations, but are those useful? And that's more difficult. So, I mean, I would say, depending on exactly which work, I can give you an answer, but that is a key problem of trying to make sure you discover rules that are useful, expressive.
I have a question. So, in your opinion, which one is the most challenging for the future? Which one is the most challenging task or research topic in urban data analysis?
If you permit me to give two answers, I will. The first answer is adoption or usage, right? So I spent a year in a department of architecture in Europe, one of the best architecture departments, and these architects were proposing all of these wonderful urban designs to solve so many problems, beautiful concepts. So I asked every single one of them, do you live in something like what you're proposing? No, I live in a super inefficient house, right? So even the people who are proposing this, right, we don't necessarily do what we say we're doing. So I think one of the biggest challenges is adopting these things that we propose. Adopting it at the citizen level, adopting it at the administrative level. That's one of the biggest challenges. And that's not exactly a computer science issue, though you as computer graphics people can influence because we can make pictures, and pictures can be pretty, and a pretty picture attracts attention. If you just show a bunch of numbers, it's not as convincing as a pretty picture, so to speak. The other answer would be, I may be biased, but the concept of air pollution and weather is really important. So that's why I'm focusing more and more on things related to the environment, the weather, and so forth. The city really influences that, and we can really make a difference. And we can make a difference by choosing the right policies, right? You know, yes, if you drive an electric car versus a gasoline car, it'll help the environment. And that's wonderful, and maybe you should, and all that. But it's nothing near as significant as the amount of pollution that Lima produces, for instance, right, as a whole. So if you can control that, that's much more significant.
Questions?
Hi. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very inspiring. So my question will be, how much will cost to implement the whole model in a city, for example? Why not here in Arequipa? I mean, in terms of money, of course, and in terms of time.
For modeling cost, in terms of dollars or soles, I would hope zero. So with the WUDAPT effort, it's free, right? We give you everything you need to set up how to model the climate and air pollution of a city. So that's free. But it costs money to have people do it, right? And then the other money aspect is if you want more detailed information, maybe you care about traffic, maybe you care about taxis, maybe you care about socio-economical development, that requires a little bit more funds to get that information. So there is, I'm sure, an Arequipa urban planning department, but it might not be very advanced in terms of all the things we're talking about. So getting that information, which is on paper, into a suitable digital form, or is in physical reality, getting that into a form that we can do computational urban design with, that's what you need to do. So technology, I think, fortunately, is rather cheap these days. So, you know, computers are not nearly as much as what they were some years ago, and computer graphics is not either. So you don't really need a huge capital, you know, with probably funds that the Arequipa Alcaldía Mayor's office can spare. They can really do a lot of stuff. So if you can somehow convince them, look, we can improve, reduce the pollution, improve traffic just by getting the current information, using the current tools, right, and giving you an educated answer, that will really help. Most of the effort, I think, is going to be some money and then time and convincing and things like that, I think. And this is the same problem. So in cities around the world where I've given some talks, been some places, we've deployed software in different cities. The software might be great, the tools and science would be wonderful. And then we get the politicians say, oh no, you know, we don't need this, right? And then the whole thing is gone, right? So that's really what you have to try and convince, educate. Have the people come here to this conference, the future conferences here in Arequipa, so they can see and hear about the latest and greatest, and then they can maybe get convinced, maybe for next year.
First of all, thanks for your presentation, Daniel. My question is, what's the purpose in the long term about the study? About I don't know, maybe to do a simulation in different points of, according to the temperature, for example. I suppose that there are take a different actions, right? I don't know, maybe develop a devices or some, but in the real life, according to the real life, no the simulation. What's the purpose in the long term to this study?
So is your question, what is the long-term objective of all this planning?
Yeah, right.
Maybe this is the long-term objective. There is people, and there's only going to be more people. So different people might say that at some point there's not enough food for there to be more people. Fine. Maybe at some point we're all going to die of hunger. But there's more and more people. So how do we deal with all these people? So if you live here in Arequipa, I'm sure you see that traffic, there's only more traffic. There's never less traffic. So if there's more people in Arequipa and the inside of Arequipa stays the same, what's going to happen? You're going to get more and more congestion and dirty air, pollution. Only gets worse. So how do we deal with that? So one way of doing that is by planning and thinking ahead and deciding what changes to do to a city so in the future these things are better and you can improve them. So that's why we want to do kind of long-term urban planning, to accommodate the urban growth. Now we could say, stop growing the city, yes, but then some other city is going to grow someplace else, and they will have the same problem. So we can't stop it unless we stop the human reproduction system somehow, right? So there's always more people. And then on top of that, there is pollution, environment, resource, and energy, and all these things, right?
Maybe it can be useful for predict, right? Predict.
Yes, so there is a prediction side, there is a planning side, that's right. They're all different aspects of the problem.
Yeah, because I thought about, I don't know, maybe develop or implement some aspects to take control in the real in the real life, for example, not simulation. For example, I want to decrease in some parts of the city, decrease the temperature. I don't know, maybe take some kinds of controls, no, for decrease the temperature, the pressure, right?
I'm not sure I quite got that. You were saying you want to affect some parts of the city and not others?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. You might prioritize and say that this part of the city is more, I want to affect more than this other. That's true. We had some study that, well, I didn't talk about vegetation, and it was in Chicago. They wanted to have parks with certain species of trees because the trees were good. But if they didn't make the parks big enough space between the trees, those trees would die. And then it was useless money. So therefore, planning what trees to put based on the amount of space you have was important. Same thing with, say, traffic. If you just say, oh, we need, there's a phenomena which is that sometimes if you control traffic more, you think, oh, it'll get better, but actually it'll get worse. So then you have to know, how do I do that? And these are all kind of complicated systems, and the answers are not simple. And it will be very different for Arequipa than for Cusco and then for Puno, right? So you need very localized answers to each one of these things. So I'm just trying to provide tools. Ultimately, the local people, your local government, has to adopt what works best in Arequipa. Because what works in Arequipa will not necessarily work in Cusco and in Puno. They have other dimensions of the problem. All I can do, myself at least, is provide tools and then hope that, as the previous person asked, that somebody from the local administration will use those tools to try and figure out the best answer for Arequipa, the best answer for Cusco, the best answer for other cities, and so forth.